You're listening to KXVS, the voice of Stockton. Streaming live on Facebook, YouTube, TuneIn, and Simple Radio. And it's time for Delta Flows with your host, Barbara Barrigan-Parrilla.
Thank you, Don, and welcome everyone. Delta Flows is the show that's everything about the Sacramento, San Joaquin Delta and the San Francisco Bay Delta estuary. On today's show, we will be discussing the history of immigration to the Delta and Stockton, and the links between the Delta history and urbanization in this region. Joining me in the studio is Phillip Merlo, and Phillip is a teacher at Franklin High School and local historian. Welcome, Phillip.
Good to be here.
We're glad you're here. So you've been working on some intense and detailed historical research, and I'm hoping you could describe for our listeners what kind of research you've been conducting in relation to the Delta and the history of urbanization and the urban periphery. And, I know a lot of your research, rather than just simply being narrative or anecdotal, is really statistical, data-driven. So particularly on immigration. So can you kind of describe what you're working on?
Of course, yeah. So I'm writing a book about the history of Stockton. And of course, when it comes to Stockton, in the first 100 years or so of Stockton's existence, roughly from the 1850s on to about 1950, the Delta was the primary driver of Stockton's economic growth. In fact, I would venture to say that the Delta was the reason Stockton exists and existed. To the point where the Delta was this nerve center for Northern California, for the Northern California economy. You didn't have highways until the late 1950s. You didn't have very good roads. You did have rail. You had great north-south rail lines. You had rail lines going through the Delta. But the Delta itself and the different canals that were built in the 1870s, those facilitated most of the resource-driven economy and the agricultural economy in Northern California, to the point where if you had agriculture in Fresno, that was not getting that, like any agricultural goods were not getting to the world unless they passed through Stockton's port and went to San Francisco. So to answer your question, what I've been doing with this statistical data-driven analysis, it sounds more serious than it actually is, but I've been looking at population estimates for different towns in the Delta, different towns on the periphery of the Delta, Stockton, eventually Lodi, places like Elk Grove, Walnut, Locke. I've been looking at the economic growth of those towns and cities, specifically, as the book is about Stockton, specifically Stockton in terms of how the port and the logistics trade that the logistics economy rather that developed around the port allowed for Stockton to have this outsized economic influence relative to its population. So, for example, Stockton in 1920 had 40,000 people, but it had about 22 or 23 luxury hotels. In addition, in addition to a massive number of single occupancy hotels.
Okay.
So how does a city with 40,000 people have that many luxury hotels?
Okay.
Right. And you have to think about it. And then when you start looking at the evidence, okay, so the amount of economic output going out of the port of Stockton in that time period was huge. And you start to think about it, and then you look at the entertainment industry. So not only do they have luxury hotels, but Stockton in like the 1920s had, depending on the year, between like the 4th and 10th largest number of entertainment venues per capita in the country of any city over 20,000 people.
That's wild.
Yeah. I mean, and not just, they had theaters, they had movie theaters, the Nickelodeon type things. They had dance halls, they had bordellos, they had brothels, all kinds of things. But it was a huge epicenter for this, for entertainment. And so then you start to look at the different resource economies of the North State, and you start thinking, okay, you start looking at their business records, and you start to see that like the California Lumbermen's Association was literally transporting everything south that came from the Sierra Nevada or the Coast Range, south of like Williams, through Stockton. So that's a
right.
massive amount, right?
Right.
That's. I mean, the redwoods and the lumber that built San Francisco and Oakland was transported through Stockton for the most part. Same thing with gold, right? Almost all the gold from the southern lode and a large percentage of the gold from the north lode actually was transported through Stockton.
Okay.
So when you think of it that way, you've got these resource economies. In addition to agriculture, which of course Stockton, after the 1870s when the Delta was really built, Stockton had this huge agricultural economy. And on top of that, back then you could actually travel the San Joaquin River by boat, right? So like all the way down to Fresno. And so all the agriculture down to Fresno was coming through Stockton. And so you had business people, you had farmers, you had
the
resource businessmen. Yeah, the California Lumbermen's Association actually set up its headquarters in Stockton in the 1920s.
Okay.
You had these people that were actually setting up shop in Stockton as like a transfer depot, right? And they'd actually have like an office space in Stockton to account for the different amounts of lumber or gold or agricultural products, in some cases other minerals, things like silver and copper, that were going through Stockton.
Okay.
Right. And so what would happen is you had a lot of people who did not actually live in Stockton, but were coming to Stockton. So
almost maybe like people now go to Silicon Valley and kind of work during the week and then go home.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Right. So what was happening, like you'd have 40,000 people that were permanent residents of Stockton, but based off of the number of people that were staying in these hotels, that number could easily swell to 50 or 60,000.
Interesting.
Which is a lot of people for 1920 California. Right?
Well,
that puts it as the fourth or fifth largest city.
Right, and to have a quarter of your population transient and that needs to be fed and entertained is kind of makes for a wild economy.
Yeah. And not only was a quarter of the population transient in that capacity, you also had all these towns out in the Delta that were essentially work camps for the Chinese, Filipino, it's some parts of the early 1910s Japanese communities that were actually working out there in the Delta for like 3 or 4 days at a time. They'd have shifts and then they'd come back. And they're not necessarily considered part of Stockton's population either. In fact, if you look at statistical estimates of those towns and of Stockton's Chinese population, Susan Sun Minig did this in Samfo, a book that was written in the 80s about Stockton's Chinese community. If you look at her estimates and then you compare them to like actual census records, it seems like the census in 1920 did not actually account for a large number of people that were moving back and forth between Stockton and a town like Holt, which existed on Shima Tract, or you go even further out to Locke or Walnut Grove.
Help me with Holt here. Who lived in Holt?
Holt was otherwise known as the 35-cent town, because it was the town that you could take a train from Stockton to, and it would cost 35 cents. And so the Chinese community referred to it as the 35-cent town.
All right.
It was predominantly a Chinese work camp in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. Where you would have essentially, so in the 1870s, the Chinese population of California was marshaled to build the Delta. So the Delta was built by these Chinese work crews that would work in shifts. And what happened was that you had this large amount of, so in 1868, I'll step back a minute. In 1868, the state of California withdrew restrictions on the amount of swampland that any one person could buy. So at that point, before that point, you were restricted to 640 acres. After that, that restriction was withdrawn, and as a result, you had these big business capital farmers from the Bay Area, and even as far as like the Louisiana Delta, who saw an opportunity, and so they went ahead and purchased these massive tracts of swampland, and then they would pay the Chinese working community that had mostly come for the gold rush, but was also coming even at that time. As a result of push factors from the Pearl River Delta in South China. And they would pay these workers to essentially, with wheelbarrows, build deltas, build levees, exactly. And so Holt was one of those towns that people were based out of. And it was on Shima Tract, on the west end of Shima Tract, so very close to Stockton. And there was a rail line that went to it. The rail line actually kept going all the way to Antioch at the time. And essentially, I don't even know if there are ruins out there. I'd like to go out there, but there's no actual transportation to where Holt was.
Right.
Because if you look out on a map, all the roads out on Shima Track do not go there. It does appear that like an old rail line does go there, but I don't think that rail line is in use anymore. So I don't actually know what's out at Holt. I'd like to go, but it's private property, so I don't know if I'll be able to do that.
Okay.
But essentially it was a town. There were a lot of brothels. There were a lot of bars and speakeasies. In the 1920s, they were speakeasies.
Right.
It was a transient community where you had large numbers of people that were living there to work, up to, 5,000 people that were living there to work during the week and then coming back to Stockton for entertainment.
For entertainment.
On weekends.
And what about as they started to develop families and they ended up settling in Stockton?
Yeah. So generally speaking, when family development becomes, I'd say that the family development starts to happen during World War I and then really picks up in the 1920s. You do start to see a lot more of those families actually settling down in Stockton. And that's around the time that you start to see a lot of pressure from agriculturalists and agribusiness to get Filipino migrants to Stockton.
Okay.
And so you sort of see a population shift in terms of demographic population shift in terms of who's working in the Delta.
Okay. So it starts to shift from Chinese labor to
Filipino.
Labor.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So can we talk about that next wave then, and where did people work there, and what was the difference? Because the Filipino community wasn't building the levees. The levees were pretty much built by
the levees were built. The Chinese workers in like 1890 through the 1920s, they were mostly working on farms. They were also in some cases working in industrial capacities for the port or for different factories in Stockton.
Okay. But
a lot of them worked on farms. And in the 1920s, you start to see, I don't know if domestication is the right word, but a lot of people settling down into essentially American-style nuclear families in Stockton, in Chinatown, which for the most part does not exist anymore.
Right.
But it was actually the third largest Chinatown in the country.
Well, that's it.
So,
for our listeners who may not know, can you tell them where Chinatown was located in Stockton?
Yeah, so Chinatown was located off El Dorado Street, kind of close to where the Crosstown Freeway is. So Washington Street and El Dorado.
Right, and you still see remnants.
Still see remnants. The Franco building, which is the large faux Chinese building, was actually built on the side of one of the main streets of Chinatown. And so if you actually go there, you can see all the dragon tiles, and you can see the statues of Chinese lions and dragons that are still there.
Right.
You don't actually have much of a Chinese community living in Chinatown anymore.
Right.
It's pretty much all
dispersed.
Yeah. But as the Chinese community became increasingly urbanized, and by the 1920s, Stockton had the third largest Chinatown in the country. It was a huge urban agglomeration. Mostly, people that were in the Delta, because Terminus had about 600 people that were 600 Chinese workers. Holt had at various points anywhere between 100 and 5,000. You had Chinese people in Locke, of course, historically, Walnut Grove. All these different towns out in the Delta. A lot of the Chinese community would either congregate in Stockton or Sacramento, to the point where Stockton, again, had like the third largest Chinatown in the country.
It's significant.
It's significant. And so in the 1920s, you start to see the different farmers in the Delta, and especially like the industrial farmers, the ones who own massive tracts of land, mostly in the South Delta and in the Central Delta. You don't really see a lot of large, 1,000+ acre tracts of land owned by one farmer in the North.
It's interesting because you call them so large, and yet they're still so small compared to other farm areas in California.
Sure.
Right.
But with the Delta being so agriculturally productive,
right?
1,000 acres of land in the Delta can be as productive as 5,000 acres of land down in the South Valley. So, yes, smaller compared to other things, but still very significant economically.
Right.
You start to see them, the Philippines were a U.S. colony at that time. And so you start to see our U.S. territory is a colony, of course. You start to see those capital capital-based farmers start to essentially put out feelers in like Manila and other cities in the Philippines, pressuring for, employees,
Okay.
right? And it was all facilitated through San Francisco. And you start to see, massive Philippine immigration to the Delta.
All right.
In like 1925, I want to say, is when you start to see it. The Stockton record, which does actually do a pretty good job back then of detailing a lot of this. The Stockton record noticed that in 1926, the Dagohoy Lodge, which is a fraternal organization for Filipino men, was founded in 1926 in Stockton.
Okay.
So that might be a good barometer of when it really became a significant part of the community. Okay. 1925 is when you start to see actual immigration to Stockton.
Right.
And what was happening is that by that point, a lot of the towns out in the Delta, not Terminus, not Locke or Walnut Grove, but definitely Holt, and a few other towns that don't exist anymore, they had essentially kind of folded up, because as the Chinese community left, they took a lot of things with them. They took a lot of the infrastructure with them, because a lot of the buildings were essentially shanties. They were shanty towns.
Right.
And so what happened was that the Filipino community would actually, it focused on El Dorado Street, Washington, and further east from Chinatown.
Right.
A few blocks down Washington, Lafayette, San Joaquin Street, those streets.
Okay.
And what would happen was that they would stay in single occupancy hotels.
Okay.
So, which were these hotels? There's a great historian out of Berkeley. His name is Paul Groth, who wrote a book about these hotels in Stockton, Sacramento, and other parts of the United States.
All right.
Where you'd have, a 4 or 5 story building, and you would pay for your night, and it would cost, very low cost for the night, and an extra fee if you wanted to have free food.
All right.
So you might have like a 50 cent per night plus another 50 cent if you wanted to have free lunch and dinner.
Okay.
And so what happened is that you had all these Filipino men, almost all men, okay, that would live in these single occupancy hotels year round.
Okay.
And so that's when you start to have permanent migration for the Delta, or from the Philippines to Stockton. But what would happen is that they were still working out in the Delta or in the areas around Stockton. And they were doing mostly very strenuous agricultural labor, picking asparagus and other things.
Okay.
And at the time, up until the mid-1930s, Stockton actually had a very sophisticated rail system, like a tramway system.
Wow.
That could take, you could take the tram. So
Right.
say you were you were living on Lafayette Street downtown.
Right.
And you were a Filipino worker.
Right.
Who was, just there, right? And,
Right.
And if you were part of a work crew, you could then take the tram to the port. You could take a ferry out to wherever you're going to be, or in some cases, you could actually take the tram to the farm.
Okay.
Because of how extensive that tram system was. And eventually, you get to start to work. And so Stockton ended up serving as the nerve center of the agricultural economy, and as is also the bedroom community for a lot of these laborers who were not spending their days in urban Stockton. They were working out in the fields, but then they would come back.
And they would come back.
And they would
at
build
night.
community, right? You have a lot of social clubs, a lot of dance halls. Thanks to the efforts of the Little Manila Foundation, is still around, the Rizal Social Club, which is the most important of them in terms of size. And of course, it was all male men, right?
Right.
So these social clubs were populated by people of other ethnicities
As well.
Yeah. So
Okay.
you might have Chinese dancers, you might have white dancers that were working in these social clubs, and it was a really dynamic community. I mean, it ended up being like 20,000 people by like the late 30s. Right. So
That's significant, especially if the population was about 40,000.
Yeah. It's hard to exactly estimate, because census records back then, if they weren't done in hand, a lot of times they were not. It wasn't an exact science. I don't think you can call the census records from the 1920s an exact science.
Okay.
Especially in immigrant California. So Stockton grew a massive amount in the 20s and 30s. and 40s as a result of Delta immigration, because it's not just Filipino migration, it's also Chinese migration is still occurring. You don't really see a lot of Chinese migration because of the different foreign alien acts, but you still see some.
Right.
You still see a trickle of that. You see a lot of people from Europe. You see a lot of Italians in the 20s starting to settle in Stockton full time. You see a lot of people from around the state that are migrating to Stockton full time. The 1920s is also when you start to see a fairly large Mexican community. There had always been a California community in Stockton, but you start to see Mexican migrant workers coming to Stockton as well. So Stockton grew massively in the 20s.
Isn't there also a black migration to Ileton that farmed as well?
Yeah, there was actually. So Stockton has one of the oldest African-American communities in the state.
Right.
And that might just be a result of Stockton being one of the oldest communities in the state.
Sure.
But so the West End, which was kind of the far western, so this Chinatown, this little Manila community that developed. It was on the west. It was bordered by what was called the Japanese Quarter, and on the further west of that, there was an African American community.
So where would that be roughly located now, if we were
Lincoln
to describe
Street.
it? Okay.
Lincoln Street, and it went all the way south towards Hazleton.
All right.
And there's also, if you go east of California Street. So if you go, so California Street used to be the border of what was considered the ordinanced area of Stockton. So east of there, you could, communities of color could actually settle and not be harassed or, terrorized. So you do see a lot of historical African-American communities over there.
That moved
in addition
there as
to El Barrio de Shiva, which was the historic California and Mexican community on the south side, as well as an Italian-American neighborhood.
All right.
Which was centered by Geneva Bakery and the Cavour Club.
All right.
So, and of course, all of those communities came largely because of the Delta and the interaction between the Delta and Stockton. But yeah, the African American community during the Great Northern Migration in the first 30 years of the 20th century, you do actually see a lot of immigration from parts of the South, Mississippi in particular, to Stockton. Yeah. And again, a lot of these people were going to work in the fields, but also in factories.
The factories came later, closer to World War II, right?
No, actually. So the interesting thing is the way I like to describe it is if you have so the Delta, you have Delta geography, and that was Stockton's competitive asset, right? If you're thinking about this in terms of economic terms, so you have this Delta geography that allows for it to be essentially this nerve center for trade in Northern California.
Right. And
then on top of that, you have this migrant immigration. So you have this population, right? And you also have this transient community that's fueling this huge entertainment and luxury economy.
Right.
Right. Well, when you have lots of people and you have such great economic, competitive advantage, people, industry comes, right? And so in the first 10 years of the 20th century, you actually start to see this really interesting thing where patents were being filed in Stockton workshops.
Right.
In massive numbers.
Right.
I mean, by the thousands. And of course, some of those patents ended up, of course, famously Holt Factory, Holt Enterprises, built the first tractors, Caterpillar. Caterpillar ended up moving to Peoria, Illinois in the late 1920s. Right. But they still had a presence in Stockton into the 30s. On top of that, most people don't know, but there was a man named Robert Letourneau. He was a capitalist. He saw Stockton as a great place to be for his interests and innovational, his startup as you were. Well, in the 1920s, he filed 300 patents. He invented the earth mover.
All right.
Yeah, and so the earth mover was also invented in Stockton, and they stayed in Stockton until the 60s, and they were this huge driving force of the economy. You also had Tilly Lewis and her cannery empire.
That's right.
Being built in the late 1920s into the 30s that would eventually, so you had all this industry in Stockton that was very innovative. You had thousands of patents between 1900 and 1940. You had some key pieces of American industry that were invented in Stockton, the tractor and the earth
So everyone
mover.
was coming for those jobs as well.
Yeah, right. And so you had a lot of people working in those factories. You had a lot of people working in canneries, right? Because
Right.
again, agricultural center, you need the infrastructure to support that. If you want to trade food long distance.
There was even a commercial salmon fishery canning center here. So.
There was. It was out on Rough and Ready Island, as I recall.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, huge industry. The port was, the port still is the wealthiest, entity in Stockton. $180 million in revenues. Back then, it was this driving force that created the rest of the economy. And it's interesting, if you look at the urban settlement patterns of Stockton, it wasn't until the 1960s or 50s really, at which point the port and the delta had lost significance as a result of the construction of the highway system, that people started to move out, to build out, right? You started to build north of the Calaveras River, or you started to build east of Wilson Way. Well, I guess Okietown had been east of Wilson Way, but up north, like the areas near Lincoln Center or the areas near Chavez High School. Those communities weren't even considered for development until like after the port had lost significance.
So really, a lot of what changed in Stockton is related to the history of the car. For our listeners who are joining us, this is Delta Flows on KXVS, the voice of Stockton. I'm Barbara Barrigan-Parrilla, and joining me in the studio is local historian Phillip Merlo. We're discussing the history of immigration to the Delta and how Delta immigration shaped Stockton's urbanization.
Cool.
All right.
Yeah.
So we're talking, the car kind of started to change things in terms of how migrant communities kind of spread out then, but they also settled and they stayed. One of the interesting phenomena for us at Restore the Delta is we've worked with people on projects, sometimes for state testimony, sometimes for writing pieces, and we'll work with someone that will go home and talk to their family and realize, oh, we came here, my great-grandparents worked in the Delta. They worked in agriculture, and they really don't have an idea that there is this connection between their family coming here and that it was the Delta that their family came here for. So I know you're working right now with the Little Manila Foundation on a historical project. We hope to have them on to talk about it more in their work in the weeks to come, because they do such a great job tracking their history. But I was hoping you could describe for our listeners what it is that you're working on with this group.
Yeah, so Little Manila Foundation, for those of you who are not familiar, is a community preservation and community building organization and cultural heritage organization that's based out of South Stockton. They famously, for some people infamously, for me it's a heroic thing, they saved the last three buildings of Little Manila in the late 1990s, early 2000s from redevelopment and demolition. Including the Rizal Social Club, and including the Mariposa Hotel, which is where Cesar Chavez and Larry Leong agreed to create the UFW. Okay. So, super cool history there. And what I'm doing with them right now, so one of their board members, Lang Lantau, who's also a school district, who's on the school board, he created this thing called Us History, with Dylan Delvo, who's their director. Us History, as opposed to U.S. History, is an ethnic studies and local history course that they're teaching out of Edison High School. It's an after-school program. Super cool, really awesome, great community of students who come from across the city, actually. You have people from Bear Creek that show up, Lincoln, Langston Hughes Academy. Occasionally you have some people from Franklin, a lot of people from Edison. Once in a while you get people from Stagg. Once in a while you get Delta College kids. Okay. And essentially it's an ethnic studies class. And this year that we've been doing a lot of local history as well. In fact, I taught 2 local history classes in December. I'm going to be teaching a course later on this next semester on the construction of whiteness and the construction of race. In addition, in partnership with a friend of mine, Aldrich Sabak. Okay. So really, it's not so much a project so much as it's an educational project, right? Because the biggest issue with Stockton, and the reason I'm writing this book, and the reason I do all this research, and the reason I'm on this radio show today, is that historical amnesia is one of the great blights of Stockton today, where you have, these 320,000 people. In the Stockton metropolitan area, it's like 700,000 people, and nobody knows their history,
right?
Because Stockton was this, this migrant community. And then as a result of the construction of the highway system, in addition to really terrible city policies in the 60s where they essentially demolished all the cool neighborhoods. They demolished Little Manila, Chinatown, the Japanese Quarter, the Little Italy, El Barrio de Shiva. All those communities were demolished for quote unquote redevelopment in addition to
moving
in addition to creating the freeway, right?
Right.
And so, 40,000 people displaced in the 60s. Displacement leads to the destruction of historical narratives in communities, right? And if you don't have a built environment to reference as your history, it's really hard to teach kids, your children, the history of your landscape, right?
Right.
And so this historic amnesia is terrible. And so really my goal with that organization and working with them, in addition to the fact just like hanging out with them because they're really cool people, is I like to teach the youth of Stockton about Stockton. That's really been one of the things that I've really dedicated myself to while here. And it's interesting because you teach them about redlining in Stockton or the city ordinances that prevented people of color from living north of Main Street or Harding Street, depending on the year. You talk about the entertainment culture in Stockton, which really most people don't know about. The hotel culture, which again, most people in Stockton don't really know about. You talk about the built histories of their communities. You talk about the architectural history. Not really connected to the Delta, but Stockton was a really huge architectural, landmark city in the early 20th century.
You can still see it now. People are fascinated when they come to work with Restore the Delta.
Yeah,
they walk through downtown.
They walk through downtown. It's like, wait a second.
This is wonderful.
This is like San Francisco.
Right.
Yeah. And so the kids, they start to develop a lot more pride and passion for their community.
Right.
Because they're starting to learn things about their community. And it's interesting, but if you talk to the average person in Stockton, there are a lot of people who would guess that Stockton is only 40, 50 years old.
That's true.
Because if you look at the infrastructure of North Stockton, if you live by Chavez High School, and that's the area you're from, and you never go downtown, you would never think that Stockton is that old.
That's true. Right?
You would never think that Stockton's like one of the oldest communities in California because the built environment that you live in is not that old. It's 20, 30 years old, right? So it's really interesting. But yeah, it's mostly just teaching Stockton youth, and especially students from the South Side and disadvantaged communities, about their history. Because history is empowerment, right? No history, no self.
Well, and that's the same gap we have, I believe, for even, I think the interior Delta communities, particularly up north, have perhaps a better sense of history.
Oh yeah, they're great. It's because they didn't have huge capitalist farmers.
And water leaders locally have a wonderful sense of history, but somehow there was a disconnect between this connection for urban people to the Delta as their resource and the source of their economy, and really the source of their history as well.
Well, I think that disconnect is a result of the rapidity of American economic growth in the post-World War II era, in addition to the complete dispersal of those communities from their built communities, right? Like you have the populations that were centered around, just south of Main Street in Stockton,
right? And
all of those communities were displaced in the 50s, 60s, and 70s to the point where, again, 40,000 people displaced in the 60s. And the compensation, first of all, the city did not provide adequate, displacement housing for those people. Right. Famously in for Little Manila, the people that were displaced by the West End redevelopment plan were given about a 40 square foot room.
That's amazing.
Which is the size, is smaller than a prison cell. I mean, it's much smaller than the room we're in now.
Right.
And so, that was the displacement housing, right? And so people there was no centralized congregation of people. And it's interesting, you look at the Italian American community that had been centered in South Stockton.
Right.
They completely dispersed right? You know, there's
Right.
someone went to Stockton, but someone went to Linden, Manteca, Lodi, right? They completely dispersed, right? The Chinese community, you still had a Chinese core in Stockton, but you had a lot of people that moved to the Bay Area and Sacramento to be in other Chinatowns. Of course, Sacramento 10 years later would also have redevelopment, and there would be a lot of displacement there. The Japanese community mostly moved to Lodi. And those histories were, you know, again, you lose your built environment, you lose your sense of community, and you start to have complete dispersal of people. And it's really difficult to have a shared sense of communal history. And with the populations of Stockton that were not displaced, the people that were living in the Magnolia District, the people that were living in Tuxedo Park, areas off of Wilson Way,
Right.
off of Harding, those people were not as closely tied to the port just due to geographical location. And B, those communities benefited a lot more from the construction of the highway system than the communities that were displaced,
Okay.
right? Because those communities had cars, they had access to jobs, they had the money, they had the capital to go buy a car.
Right.
And so the port to pavement transition disproportionately had a negative effect on the communities of color in Stockton, for sure. Displacement was huge. Loss of economic wealth was serious, even though most of those people did not live or own the place they lived in. They lived in single occupancy hotels.
Sure.
But they owned businesses.
Right.
Those businesses completely displaced. You know, huge economic disturbances in downtown. It was a dynamic system too, because a lot of, you know, after those communities were displaced, a lot of the white businesses downtown, they left because they didn't have anybody to sell to.
Well, right.
Right.
They lost
Right.
their customer base.
Right, they lost their customer base.
The people with money
The transient
Right.
businessmen that were coming to Stockton
Right.
for trade, they weren't coming anymore, and so they all moved to North Stockton. And so you lose your built environment, and on top of that, and I won't bash anyone, but historical preservation in Stockton, there were no institutions, or very few institutions, I'd say very few institutions in that time period that were actively working to value and document those histories.
Right.
And when you're being displaced, it's hard to document. Like, you know, there's a lot of emotional trauma. Like, I'm sure that a lot of people, I mean, PTSD was not a thing back then, but I'm sure that a lot of people in those communities that were displaced had PTSD for the rest of their lives.
Because it was so quick and sudden.
Yeah, right. I mean,
the redevelopment.
And not only that, like, it looked like a bomb field. If you look at like aerial photography of Stockton from like the 1960s, it looks like World War II. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, it looks like Dresden. Like, you know, like they just blew everything up and demolished it. And, you know, there is still a rubble heap in South Stockton, or not South Stockton, in off. You can see it from the Crosstown Freeway, but it's off Old Main Street, behind Weber Tech Institute.
All right.
That rubble heap is from the demolition. It never left.
It never left.
Right, but imagine all of that swath of Stockton looking like that. Right, like that. It was, you know, it was traumatizing. It had to have been.
So your project that you're working on with Little Manila Foundation in these classes helps people reconnect. What are other ways you see people being able to understand their history of Stockton and then broader into the Delta? How do you see people being able to reconnect to that history and to use it to economic advantage?
So reconnecting to the history, I think that it's interesting, as cars become less in vogue and there's more of a sense among certain political communities that, you know, rail and water transportation might be more sustainable and also cheaper.
Right.
I think you'll start to see that the port is continuing. I mean, the port is still this huge economic entity in Stockton.
Right.
You know, 5,000 jobs, 5,600 jobs, $180 million in revenues. It's really important for the city.
That's right.
I suspect that this port will continue to grow. In terms of how people start to reconnect to their history, I hope people read my book when it comes out in about a year.
Sure.
But also entities like Little Manila Foundation, Khmer Space. So, for example, down at the county, there's this really awesome historical exhibit about the Cambodian community that immigrated to Stockton in the 1980s. And Khmer Space is one of the organizations based in Stockton facilitating that. You have, the Hagen Museum is a good place for people to go. I'd like to see more outreach from the Hagen Museum to the community itself. And I think that over time that they're going to see that there's a lot of a market for that and there's a profit motive to do that. So hopefully they get into that. So ethnic studies was currently passed in Stockton schools last year as a result of US history is a huge win for us.
Right.
I'm hoping that at some point the school board will recognize and the curriculum director at the school will recognize the value of Stockton's history and how easily it ties into state standards and how easily it ties into the Common Core and how easily it can be done.
Right.
And that they start to implement a lot of local curriculum into the ethnic studies curriculum. I'm hoping that that's the case. I think that the San Joaquin County Historical Society has a part to play. They have an awesome museum. It's all dedicated to history. And they actually, if you go online and you read their journals over the past 50 years, they've done a great job documenting parts of the Delta's history.
Okay.
That they do attract good scholarship that's accessible to the community for free. And it's all published on their website for free. So I think that's a great opportunity. In terms of community organizing, I think that it would be really cool if you had an organization completely dedicated to Stockton history. The Stockton History Facebook page is awesome. They do a lot of documentation. There's also a lot of silly stuff, but that goes on there. But history
can be silly.
Yeah, history can be silly.
Right.
Yeah, history can be silly. It could be a good source of comedy. But it'd be really cool if you had an organization working to do things like put up historical markers in Stockton. And it doesn't necessarily, it could be the Hagen Museum, it could be the San Joaquin County Historical Society, but put up historical markers, which, passive educational programming, not just in Stockton, you could do it in Lodi and Manteca, all the urban communities of San Joaquin County. You could do it in Terminus. Terminus has tons of history that essentially mark, the history of a certain place that people can walk to and from. I think that would be really awesome. I think it would make downtown more walkable. I think it would draw people. I think through art, I'd really like to see a Stockton Civic Art Gallery dedicated to Stockton history. Sure. And to Stockton historical narratives and to the communities of Stockton that were displaced. I think that, we have a, really awesome underground art scene in Stockton. And I think that would be a really great way to expand into that historical documentation.
Do you see opportunities for people through art then and literature and historical study to reconnect with the physical Delta?
Oh yeah. It's interesting, but if you drive out Delta roads, now again, in the South Delta, it's harder because in the South Delta, you had farmers with vast capital stores and other in other industries.
Sure.
And so they could pull out the shanty towns.
Right.
But if you go out, so my family has a farm on Brack Tract, so we're a farming family. And there are old structures that are 100 years old out there. And there's actually a dock that's from the original Chinatown. There's actually a Chinatown out there.
Okay.
And so there are ruins all across the Delta. And if you go on Google Earth, you can see them, right? They're still there. Not all of them have been taken away, right? And so there are these comparatively ancient places that were communities of people that were building the economy of today that no longer live there because they were displaced. They were not allowed to own their own land.
Right,
they were leasing,
right?
And we, as a community, as a city, owe a lot of debt to those people.
That's right.
And so, especially from artistic or literary standpoints, there's a lot you can do. And historically, people are already doing it. People such as myself, there's a historian out of St. Mary's College of California that's doing a history of Stockton as well. His name is Ron Assetti. The San Joaquin County Historical Society has done a lot of that. The Hagen Museum has stuff on it. Little Manila in different capacities. Fawns, the Filipino American History Museum that's based out of downtown, does stuff with that too. In terms of people connecting with the history, with the physical history of the Delta, it's harder because a lot of the Delta is private land, right? And Locke is far away. Locke is probably the easiest in terms of like programming, in terms of it's right there for you. It's been well preserved. Locke is this town in the North Delta that was a Chinese community, right? And it was built based, on the same grid style as a, Pearl River Delta town, right? But a lot of the Delta is private land now, and I think that it's unfortunate, but until the city, because the city can't actually develop out there, right? It's part of the Delta zone. But until the city and the county and other entities start to purchase land out there or create park space for people to walk through and actually like interact with the Delta, it's going to be really difficult. It's interesting. A large percentage of the Delta, you probably know the exact percentage, a large percentage of the Delta is in San Joaquin County, right?
About 40%.
Yeah, about 40%. Almost none of it's public.
Be interesting, though, even till you get to that point, to be able to work where there is public space, where you do have the ruins, to even document them for people. That in itself could almost become a driving tour.
Yeah.
Because it covers such a large geographical
I'd really
area.
love to go see Holt.
Right.
But it's on Shima Tract, and I don't remember who exactly owns Shima Tract, but it's on Shima Tract in the middle of Shima Tract.
Okay.
But I think I'd love to go see it. You can actually see parts of it on Google Earth, right? You can actually look at it from above. It's like, there's buildings there in the middle of the farm, right? Interesting, right? So I think that there's going to have to be some sort of public drive to make the Delta accessible to the public. But I mean, you can also go boating, right? But again, boating is economically prohibitive, right?
Plus, if you have a good entertainment economy that actually would drive boating into making it affordable or accessible.
Yeah.
Bill Wells was on with us a couple shows ago, and he was talking about that there are boating clubs forming. He said, well, millennials don't like owning property, but to me it made a lot more sense that you would buy into a share of a boat or be able to rent a boat.
Yeah, I mean,
needed.
There's a great festival that occurs every summer out in the Delta that's like, kind of like a Burning Man for the Delta, which is pretty cool. Went there last year. But it would be good planning on the part of the city and the county to allow for zoning that would open up the remaining parts of the Delta, I guess the periphery of Stockton that touches the Delta.
Right.
Not the settled parts, not like, not Shima Tract, not Brookside, of course, but like on the port, right? Of course, there's a lot of environmental cleanup that has to happen, but along Fremont Street, it'd be cool if, marijuana is happening, right? There should be marijuana casinos. There there are people that want to do this already. I'm not really involved in the marijuana industry, but I read business magazines, right?
Right.
And there are people who want to start setting up essentially like a casino or like a gambling den or like a resort, but like a marijuana resort.
Okay.
Right? Where, it's essentially like a vacation spot for people who wanted to smoke good weed, which, regardless of your ideas about weed, I mean, people said this about alcohol literally 100 years ago, regardless of your views on those things, entertainment, because of Stockton's location and, because of where it is, we still have the Delta geography, right? That could be huge, right? If you had some sort of if we took advantage of our location and, did that where, the Emerald Triangle is up by Humboldt County, people have to come down this way anyway to transport their marijuana to the Bay Area. You could create, in small form, you could recreate the entertainment economy that way, right? And on top of that, I don't advocate for, pork spending like the arena.
Right.
But if you had investors that were willing to invest in entertainment infrastructure in this city, it could do really well because Stockton is close to a lot of things.
Right.
Right? You know, it's only a few hours from Fresno. It's only a few hours from, like, you know, there's a huge population that Stockton could draw from for entertainment, right?
But it has to be a real
But there has to be a place to do it
Right.
besides the arena, because the arena can't do it all.
Right.
Right? So there you go.
So that would kind of boost her up, and that's kind of going back to the historical roots. Well, it's been a great conversation today.
Yeah.
We wish you luck with the book and your projects. And I want to thank Governor Don for helping us put on this show. And to our listeners, Merry Christmas, Happy Kwanzaa, Happy New Year, and have a joyous 2018. It is the season for giving, and we hope that you can go to the donation page for the Voice of Stockton and make a donation. If we could get 10,000 people in the greater Stockton area to donate $10 a year, the station would be able to flourish further with additional programming. Our promised show with the guests from the Locke Historical Society will air on January 5th, when we'll be back. And we're going to explore with them further in depth what we talked about with Philip about Chinese immigration history to the Delta. So stay tuned for that, and Happy New Year, and we'll be back.
Happy New Year. Happy holidays, guys.